Imagine yourself under a starry sky, around the warm glow of a sacred fire, where speakers gather to share their wisdom and insights. Creating a sacred space where all are welcome to warm their hands. Here are your hosts, Sarenth Odinson, Snow, Cabra, and Emily Streaking Fate. Discuss spirituality, mythology, animism, and culture around a virtual sacred fire. Won't you join us around Grandfather Fire?
Well, to the gods of new beginnings, the ancestors who taught us to dig deep, to the Vetir we share this world with. Hail to the world in the coming of spring, in the coming of sun and joy and flowers. Hail to the heralds, the daffodils, the violets, the dandelions. Hail to the blessed ones who dot the landscape, the furred creatures coming forth, all their young and all their newness and all their brightness. Hail to the blessed sun shining down on us. Hail to the cool winds blowing. Hail to the rains that drop on the earth, saturate all of us. Hail to the seed that is sown. Hail to the tree that is grown. Hail to the blessings that are born. Hail, hail, hail. Oh, beautiful and beautiful and beautiful creatures, great and small. Humans and ants and all things above and below. Thank you. Thank you for hope and renewal. Thank you for hope and comfort. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hail to you all. Rest well. All right. So welcome to Around Grandfather Fire. This is episode 153. My good friends and co-hosts, Snow and Emily Streaking Fate. How are you both doing tonight?
I am good. Work is wild, but I am good and not at work, and it is a bank holiday weekend, so I get 3 days, which is nice. Yay for bank holidays. Yeah, that's about it. How are you, Emily?
I am doing well. We got some rain this week, but not as much as we expected. So we've had some really nice weather to be outside, be in the woods. We made it to the library for a few days, which was nice. I've been reading up on like fate and destiny, Netjiru, and reading some articles on that. So it was nice to get to like a quiet place where I could focus. How about you, Sarenth?
So in addition to really enjoying the springtime weather, I'm not quite to the point where I can use the rototiller. So my father came over and worked on the land with us for a bit. Found out that the master bricklayer who built the place that we're living in, our home, he buried a ton of materials in one of the side gardens. And this is like a 35 by 35 like square foot area. And he buried like tons of these like bricks he was using for building houses and all this other building material. So like the rototiller got about 6 inches down and went, ha! So we had to dig and see what was going on. Turns out he was using it as like a holding area or a dumping ground or something, because there was metal pieces in there. I was like, oh, okay. So we may have to build up from here instead of trying to dig down. The other one's going fine. It's about a 30 by 35 plot, and hopefully we're going to get planting in soon. That's been one of the big things we've been working on. And it's kind of the inspiration for today's prayer, because yes, finally spring. I'm not usually like, yay, finally spring, but this year just seems so right.
I mean, that sounds to me like a metaphor, trying to start a project without scoping out all of the things first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, trying to do something new, and everyone else's refuse is still there.
It's irritating, but it's also kind of like, well, if we dig this up and there's all this building material under the whole spread, I guess it's shrine making materials at this point. So I'm trying to look at the blessing in it.
You found yourself a metaphor.
I'm trying. So aside from that, working on my blog like always. Working on a couple of topic uh, posts that I hope people will find interesting and fun. But those will be posted probably every Wednesday of the month. Aside from that, I'm just trying to kick back and relax until I have to go back to work. Oh yeah, I did have my workshop. Thank you for that reminder. Which was last Sunday, and that was on the basics of heathen magic, which was well attended. Actually, I was kind of surprised. And then I got two coming up this month, which is the Witches' Night Out, which is May the 14th at uh, Ann Arbor's Crazy Wisdom Bookstore. And I'll also have an online Zoom link for that, and I've already put that on my socials. If folks want the link to that, I can throw it at them. And then at the end of the month, which is Sunday, the last Sunday of the month, the 25th, I've got a Basics of How to Work with the Lanvitier workshop. So those are upcoming projects for me. Keeping busy, but not as busy as I have been.
That is good. I'm glad you're no longer so busy you're hospitalizing yourself. And that's not hyperbolic.
Yeah, well, it has a way of not being able to work all the overtime I had to work. So yeah, sometimes things happen and you got to just roll with it. So with that being said, do we want to introduce our guest?
I would be delighted to introduce our guest. So,
please do.
A well-known and well-respected writer, author, and blogger, Kaye Boesme is the person behind Callisti, as well as her own works of fiction and other writings. Raised as pagan and known for her writings on Greek religion, Platonism, and modern life, Kaye raises questions on piety, using social media, and more amongst her readers. With a background in higher education and working as a librarian, Kaye not only broadens our vocabularies, but our understandings and our minds with her words. Kaye, welcome to Around Grandfather Fire.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So one thing that I'm curious about, just straight off, is you talk about having grown up pagan and sort of raised in a pagan environment, which is a sort of stark contrast to a lot of other people's experiences. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. So I've written about this on my blog a little bit, but when I was a kid, my family just suddenly decided to go to a Unitarian society. I didn't know why until I was an adult, and I can go back once I'm kind of at a better point in the story. And when we were at the Unitarian Society, I was still a kid. My parents went off and hired a babysitter to go to something. And that ended up, I think, being one of the circles that was held in the area. So they scoped it out and then they were like, oh, it's kid friendly. And so then we just started going as kids. I was really into it. I'm about 5 years older than my middle sister and 7 years older than my youngest sister. And so like I was, I think 8 or 9 at the time, and they were a lot younger. And so I just sort of dove right in. And I mean, that was sort of a weird time because it was, only like a very short period of time, like after the Satanic Panic. It was rural Missouri. So a lot of people were, not very public about their religion. My family kind of got outed when I was in middle school because a girl moved in across or next door. And my mom was like, hey, she's in your grade, you should hang out with her. And then she told people in my school when classes started, and then that was not a really good time. But I think that it's sort of one of the interesting things that led to is just that it's sort of mostly been normal throughout my life. Like I didn't get into what one might call esotericism until I was in like my mid to late 20s. So I mean, like that's a very different sort of environment from people who are not raised pagan and who are really drawn into like the mysticism from the beginning. And my mother told me later on that the reason why we went UU Pagan was because there was actually a Christmas pageant in the one of the local churches, and one of my sisters wanted to be a shepherd. And because she wasn't allowed to, because she was a girl, she cut off her hair and she said, I am going to, become a boy just so I can be a shepherd. My mom asked some questions and she was like, wait a second, this is not like anybody can be whatever profession they want. And so then she did like some research into, because she'd majored in anthropology as an undergrad, and so she had been on like a lot of class assignments to various I think churches and other cultural sort of things. And she was like, okay, this seems like a good direction to take us in, because I know that if they have any kind of pageants, they're going to keep all of the parts open to everybody. And so and when I heard that, I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, because when you're a kid at the time, your parents make decisions and you're like, oh, okay, I guess this is what we're doing now. Yeah.
That's amazing. And how awesome of your parents to be so caring about their kids that they're like, yeah, we're going to an environment that actually will accept them the way they are without having to completely upend everything. Sorry, that just really touches my heart.
Yeah, and my mom, I think that, now that I'm in my 30s, I know that we all go through like those stages with our parents where, we're feeling a bit rebellious, we don't really understand some of the decisions that we've made. But like in retrospect, I'm looking back and I'm like, yeah, my mom did a lot of stuff that was really, really helpful to us as kids.
So, at what point do you feel like um, you kind of started to take that more quote unquote seriously? Because I mean, being raised pagan and being in that environment, and then finding yourself writing about it and blogging about it and having your own daily devotional practice in your own environment, like the one doesn't always follow on from the other.
Yes. So my dad would sometimes go to the bargain table at Walden Books. And Walden Books was a pre-Amazon bookstore that was in the local mall. So I'm an older millennial, and this is really dating me at this point. Um, so he would go there and he'd pick up some books, and there were usually a few like pagan books that were there. So like Silver Raven Wolf, like other things like that. And so when I was in middle school, I was very exposed to a lot of those writings, and I actually started up a practice pretty early on. I took shop class one year in middle school, and I actually made a bench that I then used as a small altar table. And so I had, this experience in middle school where it was sort of open. I mean, I think that for me, like, just because, sometimes I can be a little bit awkward. Like when you're getting these messages from these books that are like, here's how to hide everything from your parents. And then your parents are the ones who are like buying you the books and taking you to like the local pagan shop. I was always just sort of like, so am I supposed to talk about this stuff with my family members? Like, because it's all assuming that people are not from that background. And so that's, I think, the part that I found the most challenging about it. Just sort of like that idea of like, oh, so, like when I'm at home, I could actually like do ritual like with my parents instead of, this other thing. So I did a lot of stuff privately apart from the circles that like we went to every 6 weeks or so. And then when I was in my mid-teens, we started to go to some of the SBOTs because somebody got trained in Wicca up in like Chicago. I think she got trained in like Deanic Wicca. And yeah, and then she started to do full moon and some other lunar rituals. There were people who would come in to do some types of rituals. I think there was actually a Hellenic polytheist group that went up to Hannibal and did a ritual, but my parents were tired and didn't want to go that month, and I was really upset about that. But it is what it is. But yeah, and then there was a newsletter that the community had. Like it was I think that like the early days of the internet, like I feel a lot of nostalgia for, because that was back when like things were very community focused. Like you had the newsletters, you had the listservs, a lot of stuff was very local based. And so like as long as you got along with people locally, like you were in pretty good shape. And even if you didn't, there would be some niche listservs that you could join for other things. And it was, yeah. I think that some of the critiques that I've made of social media are sort of in alignment with that because, we have this environment that started out to be very like algorithm driven, and then people got filtered into these various types of like extreme niches, and then you really can't come together in community anymore. Like there really isn't that much motivation for people to come together, which is a shame.
So, kind of going off of that and thinking about people finding their niches, how did you go from this very kind of broad environment where you're rubbing shoulders with Wiccans and different things to where you are now, where people look at your website and the things that stand out are often the heavy presence of Platonism there and the very sort of blatant sort of Greek polytheistic elements there?
Yes. So I started praying to Apollon when I was in my early teens. I felt very competent at poetry, and I looked at a list of deities in one of the books that I had, and I was like, who do I want to pray to here? And I was like, this looks like a good option. And then I sort of went with that. So it wasn't really that thing that happens to a lot of people where they're like, ah, yes, like people having experiences. It was very, I think, very cerebral, but it ended up being a good thing. And so that's sort of where I went with that. And so I was aware of Hellenic polytheist blogs, actually, I think in my mid to late teens. I'd mentioned them to a few of the Wiccans that I knew, and they told me that Reconstructionism was a spiritual dead end and that I should stay away from those people. Which was like
Not much has changed there.
it was actually yeah, it was actually like it wasn't even the local community. It was somebody that I knew via like e-correspondence who was the strongest person against it. And so I know that I would go to some of the GeoCities sites and just read up on stuff without actually committing to any sort of practice. And I'd always really been interested in theology, and so I was looking for any theology books within that sort of non-initiatory Wicca sort of area that I could get a hold of in like the local store, which was the Opened Book in Hannibal, Missouri. And so like I was just searching and searching and searching for stuff. And then when I got to college, I joined the college pagan group. One of the reasons why I chose the college that I went to was because they had one, because I wanted to make sure that I'd have people to do ritual with, which is sort of bittersweet because shortly after I graduated, that group died because there just weren't enough people coming into it. And I think that for college students, it's a little bit hard because, you have to commit to doing that sort of college group structure with the officers and these elections and asking for the campus funding. But then at the same time, if you are a religious group, then you can't burn candles in your dorm room. The religious group membership gets you access to facilities and money from the college chapels so that then you can actually get stuff subsidized and you have a space where you are allowed to book rooms to meet. And so I think that's sort of a shame, but a lot of college students have a lot on their minds. So when I was 20 or so, I actually bought a book about Hellenic polytheism that had in the appendix section on the gods in the world. And I read that and I was like, you know what? This makes perfect sense. This is better theology than anything I've read so far. I'm going to go with this. And so then I sort of went very, very hard recon for a few years. Because of the issues between like the mainstream neo-pagan movement and the recon movement, I was very cagey about the background that I had because that was the point in time when there were people on the listservs who were like trying to hunt out like secret neo-pagans or, all of this stuff and would discredit people from coming from that kind of background. And so I tried to be as distancing as possible. I was a little bit, I veered a little bit too much in the other direction. And then meanwhile, like my parents were getting a divorce. My mom was moving back to like upstate New York. She got into a coven and she started to study initiatory Wicca and go through her degree process for that. So So there was a lot there.
So then, I'm sort of curious, at what point then did sort of Platonism become such a major focus for you and such a big interest?
That's a long and complicated story. So Todd Jackson had made this group that I joined almost immediately after just went ahead and joined a bunch of the Hellenic Polytheist listservs. It was the Kyklos Apollon listserv, which was that Delphi Dawn Sunday prayer circle that would happen in your local time zone, where like whenever the sun rose in Delphi, like you would say some sort of prayer or have some kind of ritual. And so there were a few people who were into Platonism who were there, and I think it was actually maybe Edward Butler was on that listserv, or he was on like another one. He mentioned like all like, or I think it was him who said something like, oh, like it's very accessible to get access to like all of the like theology. You just go to the like used bookstore or something and just pick up a complete works of Plato. And so I was like, wait a second, there's like, I'm going to go read some theology. And then, when you're a college student who's going to go on to graduate school, that's a really tall order to do on top of like your ordinary coursework. And so it was a lot to juggle. I know the first dialogue that I read on my own that wasn't a course assignment. And when I say course assignment, I mean, I'd read, I think, the cave excerpt of the Republic in our like high school English reader. And then I had read the Ion for a college class that I took when I was in high school. But my first dialogue on my own was a symposium. It was the most amazing thing that I had ever read. I was on the bus, like going into Ithaca from my mom's house, which is in one of Ithaca's suburbs. And it was just, it was beautiful. And I was like, wow, I have to read more of this. And then as every person who's ever been in their early 20s knows, that's easier said than done, because you've just got so much that you're doing with getting your life set up. And so it wasn't really, I would keep trying to read Platonism and learn more up until I think my mid 20s, when I hit that point at which like so much had been, I think, sort of lined up with, figuring out things, but then also no longer like being burned out by having to do all of the coursework for classes, and having like a 9 to 5 job that I was just starting out. It started to get more doable to do deeper reads of the dialogues.
I don't know what you found in writing about all of this, but in my experiences, especially online, the mention of Platonism, it causes very extreme reactions a lot of the time. And sometimes you bring it up and people get very interested and sort of leaning closer, and other times you bring it up and people switch off or they run a mile or whatever. Um, what have your experiences been sort of there? And um, do you think it seems fair that you seem to have garnered this reputation of being so sort of platonic in all of your writing?
I don't know, like I haven't noticed like a lot of like pushback directed at me personally. Like, I do think that there are a lot of misconceptions about Platonism, but I also know that like I'm in the fortunate position where like I was never assigned to read the whole Republic by somebody who didn't know what they were talking about. And so I feel like just because like my high school was the only high school in the area that was not failing No Child Left Behind, like that act in the United States that was, from the Bush Jr. administration. Like we, like it was not very, we were mostly reading from the English reader. Like we didn't learn how to write a college essay until I'd already been writing college essays in the college classes that I was taking at the college where my dad taught for I think a year and a half at that point. So I lucked out by just having like such a a lukewarm experience like in education. And then in college, I think I just was never, it was not really stuff that we read in the majors that like I was taking courses in, because I majored in English and minored in astronomy. So It was very outside of the purview. I didn't actually read any classics at all until I took a classical mythology course my senior year because I wanted to read all of the books anyway, and I figured that that would be the easiest way to get course credit for it. I've actually gotten more pushback with being a woman who is like a devotee of Apollon. Like that sort of dates back to when I was neo-pagan because people are like, oh, like you should have like a goddess that you are praying to. Like there's this very kind of like set and there's this almost rigid view towards that. I find that that's less prevalent in recon or recon adjacent spaces. And I don't really identify as like a recon anymore. I just identify as like a polytheist, but yeah, that's that undercurrent in I think the broader pagan culture is a little bit odd.
Yeah, I was going to ask because Reconstructionism has gone through such a change over the last 20 some odd years. When I first came into paganism, it was like there's neo-pagans, there's Reconstructionists, and then there's these, off the wall mystic types, which, oh, okay. I guess my question is, do you actually see Reconstructionism as a useful descriptor anymore?
I think that Reconstructionism is a methodology that is helpful when you are trying to build rituals and you don't really have anything else to go off of, and you want to like make sure that you're not just sort of like in your own head. I think that that is very helpful because, like people have a lot of like really bad ideas on their own. Like you can have some great ideas, but it's nice to be able to have like a bounding box where you're just starting from something that is there. So like Thargelia, is starting like at sunset today, and so I'm going to be celebrating it for the next 2 days. Like I've looked at source material for that. It's probably not a very like a recon style ritual. Like for one thing, I don't usually offer wine or like any of like I have like different things that I'm offering like so and there is like a very personalized aspect of the ritual, but like it does sort of there is some research at the core of it and what was done, and that's sort of like I think of like especially like in the United States with us in the Anglosphere, like where we've received like a lot of these texts that came to us through like a lot of different sources from a lot of different cultures in antiquity. Like the relationships that we're building with the gods are not the same as the relationships that the ancients had. They're our own relationships. And so I think that to have that sense of like ownership over, that relationship, you have to actually do your own thing and actually get to know the deities that you were praying to. Because it's organic. You can't just sort of like be voyeuristically looking at what other people have and expect that to.
Oh man, you
take
gotta
you.
live this shit?
Yeah, you have to sort of live it. And I mean, like that can mean different things for different people. I mean, like
Mhm.
I grew up pagan, and so like I think that in the souls in our statues, like I think that having just a core household practice for 5 to 10 minutes for most people, if you're not into mysticism, you don't want to do any kind of like deep theological study and stuff, that's probably about what you need in addition to figuring out what holidays you want to like
Mhm.
do with more elaborate meals and maybe inviting some house guests over. Like like it doesn't really take a lot, but I think that it's important to actually have a lived experience.
I find that listening to your stories and also reading your blog for I think as long as you've been blogging or damn near, one of the things that's been most striking about looking at your writing, looking at the communities that we've both swam in, has been the and myself as a convert from Catholicism, like there's this kind of zeal that with folks who are brought up, there's almost this kind of it's kind of the zeal you see with other people. Like one of the things I'm going to compare it to, and I know this is going to be a little controversial, is kind of the tradcath versus cradle Catholic conversation that's happening around right now, where you grew up in this stuff. So this is just stuff you don't, uh, with regard, and without me speaking on your behalf, excuse me. As a cradle Catholic, there's certain practices that I don't think about when people say, well, this is a really weird thing from Catholicism. I'm just like, I grew up with that. Okay. Like, I imagine with the introduction, because you were probably what, the 90s and aughts. So there's a whole bunch of practices that were just part of the community that I was in that were just like us accepted and just part of the normal way. This is how we do things kind of attitude. And it's very similar to when I was coming up in the church. Like, these are just things we do. Um, and I'm seeing, and maybe it's because I've had 20 years in the community, but I'm seeing that kind of zeal that I see with Tradcasts begin to happen with at least some of the pagans that are coming into our midst, where I got to do everything right and I got to do everything right now. And it's like, you have years. It's okay.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Please go ahead.
I think there's a difference between, because I mean, doing things correctly is important, but the correctly
Sure.
doesn't mean that you have to like do everything, like the kitchen sink of like everything. Like it's within correctness, there is a wide variety of stuff that you can do, and you can't really dive into stuff without thinking about how it actually will fit into your life, or like how you're going to have to change your life, because like habit changes are like, they're really hard for everybody.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think that that's one of the things that when you adopt a polytheist or animist mindset, like your relationship to stuff changes. Like when you actually like think about like, is this cup in front of me? Do I classify this as a person? Is this an object? Is it kind of both? I mean, you don't even have to like deep dive on theology to like look around and start pondering how you relate to the world around you. That can be pretty revolutionary on its own.
Yeah, I actually, that reminds me of when Marie Kondo's work was translated into English. A
Hmm.
lot of the people in the American minimalist communities are Christian, and some of them are very conservative Christians. They really like got uncomfortable with that section where she's bringing in some of the like Shinto based like animist practices into when you're decluttering, like what you're supposed to do with these objects, and the amount of respect that you're supposed to afford to the possessions that you were about to get rid of. And I kept reading this and I was like, wow, this is like her section about shrine tokens and what you do with like shrine objects that that you should be getting rid of, but can't bear to get rid of yet. Like that was a very relatable section of the book. Like obviously we're different cultures, but like it was still pretty relatable. But I also think to the I guess the cradle calf versus trad calf kind of thing, there was this some student at UMass Amherst, I think, did this very small study that is no longer online, but I encountered it maybe 10 to 12 years ago, because sometimes I do look up research studies on like paganism just to see if anybody is studying the kids as adults. But this person said that like if you have people who are raised in a pagan tradition, they have like a much stronger idea of what is correct ritual and what is not correct ritual. So like both of my sisters are, nominally or like in Christianity now, but like my youngest sister, when she would come to like rituals that were open from my mother's coven, she'd be like, oh, this isn't what we grew up with. So she still had like a very strongly like, the way that we grew up with, like the way that these rituals are done, if they're not done this way, then, like this is a little bit weird and uncomfortable, which I think is, I think that to one degree like depends on just sort of like how insular a community is. Like if we had been to more like pagan gatherings as kids and have been exposed to more teachers and priestly people like doing various types of rituals, like maybe that would have been a little bit different. But in a community that has like a very simple and very sort of, I wouldn't say set, because a lot of the liturgy was like improvised, but you sort of knew what the bounds of the improvisation were, because there was a structure to it and you had been to rituals before.
Oh, that's okay. That's really neat. I'm curious to see how my own kids will, um, through the years, develop and grow, and if they're going to fall into that or not. Because my one of my kids is going to be 19 pretty soon here, and it's grew up in a very. I mean, I'm an eclectic polytheist animist. I worship gods from all kinds of different culture groups, and so there were correct ways to address like Kemetic gods versus Greek gods when I was really involved with Kemeticism. And so, being mostly heathen at the moment, there's definite ways that we do things as a household. And I'm not sure that any other household does things the way we do. But I'm curious to see if this holds true as he goes off to live his own life under his own roof at some point. Because that's the hope is that you make something lasting and you make something that the kids grow into and that they can take with them when they go, but also not something that's so tightly held that it becomes like this bulwark against being able to be with other people. So it kind of brings me some hope because the idea that there is a right way to do things, like, and my baseline is like, is it respectful? I think that for a lot of us, that's the truth too. It's like, but you mentioned like there were certain ways that you folks would do improv, and there was like boundaries in the improv, even if it wasn't said from the outright. And I'm curious to see how that goes for a lot of folks who are getting second and third generations now, because that's going to lead to our religions growing in very interesting and unique ways. I'm just excited to see where this goes. Thank you for letting me know that. I'm really sad that the study isn't available online because I would love to dig into it.
Yeah, I think it was one of those sort of portfolio pieces that a student, and when UMass redesigned their website, it, disappeared. But, it was interesting. I don't know, like if maybe that person will, come back with it at some point if they can find it several hard drives later. So,
Mm-hmm. Still, that's really cool that people are still doing the research, and it's still a subject of inquiry. I like that. Thank you. Um, I guess since we're talking a lot about the theology and digging deep into it, like when you first started digging into the writings, so you mentioned that you'd only really dug into Plato with the allegory of the cave back in high school, and so these groups kind of challenged you to dig deeper and deeper. How do you begin to dig deep? Because that's something that I get a lot as a question is like, how do I dig deep? Like, what resources are useful to this project?
yeah, so I would say that like once I was able to like actually commit to doing a like actual like reading plan when I was in my like mid going into my late 20s, that then sort of picked up a lot. Like I read a lot during the COVID lockdown. For example, like I think that like when I was in my mid 20s, what was really helpful was just coming to understanding of like what types of formats worked for me and what types of formats did not work. So for example, like when I was in my late 20s, I had an ebook on my phone of the complete works of Plato, and I would actually just read a page or two in between every single set I did at the gym. So like, I was already there. You already have your phone in front of you. If you're not listening to stuff with lyrics, it's like it's not, I wouldn't say it's not difficult. Like it does involve some task switching, but like as long as everything else that you're doing is not cognitively intensive, like it's something that you can do. If you commute a lot, like you could listen to audiobooks. Like there's a lot of like stuff on LibriVox. There are the library probably has a bunch of stuff. If you want to pay for like the Amazon service for audiobooks or an additional one that's not Amazon, like there are some options there. I think that bookshop.org has possibly started audiobooks, or maybe that's just ebooks. So I think that those are some helpful things. What also really helps is to have like the understanding that this is going to be a years long project, and you will not probably stick to the plan that you make because you are probably going to have questions about the materials that you're reading. And one of the things that I always like tell students as a librarian is you should read the people, like the bibliography to see if there are other things in a text that, are interesting to you. Or like if you're reading, Plato, like look and see like if there are writings that are about the dialogues. And then like after I started to get into the Platonic commentaries in 2019, I actually would just read a dialogue and then read the commentary at about the same time, because I figured that that sort of simulated what it would have been like in a lecture environment anyway, because a lot of these surviving commentaries and fragments come out of what were originally lectures to students in the various academies. So I think that that is helpful. But yeah, it involves like a lot of just self-knowledge about how somebody learns. I use Zotero to manage a lot of stuff. I recommend that as a tool. Just make sure that it's part of your regular backup. I'm starting to sound like I'm at work now. So I use Zotero. I'm a librarian. I teach students Zotero. I teach students how to manage files and all of this stuff, but that all actually originally comes out of me trying to like wrangle my own library, because if Zotero were not a program and if it were a binder, it would just be so messy.
I completely misheard what you said. I thought you said that you were teaching people how to use the tarot as an organizational tool. I went, that's neat. Let's dig into that. Zotero.
No.
Okay.
So what's really funny, what's actually really funny is that back when Zoom captions were terrible, during lockdown, when we were doing a Zotero workshops or talking about Zotero, the captions would either say the tarot or Zorro. So either way, it sounded like a lot more interesting than what we were doing, but it was really kind of funny. And so I'd have the captions on myself because I'd like enabled them, and I would just be like trying to like do this workshop and not like laugh at the same time. So yeah.
I mean, if
Thank you
if
for clearing that up.
Antonio Banderas wants to appear in a wide-brimmed hat and do a divination reading, I'm okay with that.
Right?
I know one
Oh.
thing that I've always really appreciated about your writing and your work is you really emphasize applying what you get from all of your Platonic studies and philosophical reading, and you really sort of convey this sense of practicing Platonism, or practicing the kind of ideas and concepts that you're getting from your reading and your research and stuff, where a lot of people either view it as or really do struggle with the idea that it is very cerebral and intellectual and chin stroking, and then you put the book down and it's over and then you go do something else. So it's like they have their philosophical research over here and then their religious practice over here, whereas you seem to have really intertwined them. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about if was that something that came naturally, or was that something you had to endeavor to do, and what kind of advice would you give to people to kind of begin actually sort of practicing and applying these things and making them sort of meaningful?
Yeah, I think for me, it came very naturally. I mean, like when you're reading some of these things and you're like, oh, this looks like a meditation, or, oh, this looks like, this type of practice, or, oh, I bet I could, structure this sort of prayer thing based on this passage that I'm reading in like Proclus, for example. So that came very, very naturally. I think that like, because I think this goes back to that bit about, like the recon versus post recon versus, just polytheism conversation, where like, if you're not actually like engaging with the texts and being messy with the texts, like, are you actually like learning the text? And I think that like there are several ways to do that. Like one thing that I do really recommend is that if people do want to read something, just like find like 3 or 4 people to co-read with, because the conversations will be more illuminating than sitting down and just sort of reading through it all like on your own time. And especially like in Platonism, like a lot of the stuff that gets missed by, I think, like a lot of the online sphere of people just sort of like digging into the text on their own, is that the like Platonic school, like this was back when like books cost the same amount as like a fancy car. Like there were only a certain number of books in the room. Like you were literally reading the book together, and then like the teacher would pause and then give a lecture on a passage that while somebody else was reading. And so there's this, like there's this sense, I think, that we've lost there, and that it's nice to reclaim that a little bit, even if it's a little bit artificial, because everybody has their own copy of the work. Um, yeah, I think it's also like I was reading I think it was called Platonic Theories of Prayer, the book. It was a collection of scholarly articles that were about prayer in Platonism. And I think it was John Dillon who'd written this piece that was like, yeah, I tried out some of this meditative stuff. And I was like, well, why is it taking until like decades after like, not you as in like him, like on a personal level, like why is there no applied studies like within all of this sort of ancient like esotericism stuff that people are doing? Like why are they like, like you wouldn't do this in any other like field. You don't, like, you assume that people who are studying Tibetan Buddhism have at least gone to a Tibetan Buddhist ritual or two while they're like working with the text, even if they're not Buddhist themselves, or like all of this stuff. Like, so I think it's more like that it's also coming from like a sort of like STEAM-ish background. There's this sense that you do want to just experiment with things. Like I do view myself as a bit of an experimentalist in that sense. Like I want to play around with texts a bit and to figure out what they mean. I know, I feel like that was sort of going off into several tangents, and I hope that answered the core of your question.
Yeah, no, that was good. Don't worry. And I think a lot of that kind of sense of play and experiment and freedom and having the theory and the practice hand in hand really comes across in your writing. And I think it also seems something that you convey very well in the Souls Inner Statues. So I was wondering, for those who aren't familiar, if you could maybe talk about what the Souls Inner Statues is and why you began writing it.
Yeah, so the Soul Center Statues is this it's this book that I wrote. I think it was in like 2022 or so. Like, I actually have it with me, so let me actually look at the publication date on this. It just sort of feels like the past few years. Oh, it's actually 2023. Okay, so time seems like it has changed. But yeah, so it's a book that I wrote because I was seeing a bunch of people online in various contexts who all seem to be very nervous about starting a spiritual practice of some kind, or who would just sort of get into their own heads too much. This is about the same time where I was still on social media, and I was seeing just all of this weird stuff, like the TikTok witches, like hexing the moon, that thing that happens, like just all of this stuff, or people just with these very strange ideas. Like when I was a little bit younger, still percolating in the back of my mind was the fact that like a lot of people who read Rick Riordan got into paganism because they had spent a few years just thinking that they were like, godchildren of, a deity or other. And like, and there are kind of like echoes of that, like in what a divine series is, like in Platonism, except there's a lot more like theological rigor to that, and there's like a system. And so I was like, well, nothing is going to change if I don't actually talk about it. And I think that like when it comes to social media, like one of the disadvantages is that because everything is so splintered and spliced apart, if people get a piece of your argument without like the full, set of things that you're proposing, they're probably going to misread it. So I was like, I'm just going to go from start to finish. Hopefully by the end of people reading this book, they'll get some good things out of it. There's a chapter towards the end where I get just kind of on a soapbox about like toxic dynamics in groups that I hope is not like off-putting, but I was writing this for like an American audience, and we do have cult problems in America. So, so it's essentially a reaction to that. And I decided to make it open access online and to just have a print copy that people could have if they wanted to, just because if the goal is to get stuff in front of people that can help them, like they can purchase a book from other people once they've like reached the point where they're sort of grounded enough that they know how to put plans together. So like what I was asked, just now about the creating a learning plan, I actually have a chapter in that book about here's how you make a learning plan and here's what you need to think about when you're doing this. I mean, like, I don't have children, I just have cats. And so there are some occasions within the book where I'm like, if you have kids, like, you might have to like think about this, like with low expectations, because if you have young children, like you do have a lot of demands on your time. So just, maybe this is just you're listening to podcasts or audiobooks like while you're doing dishes or, while you're in the commuting and all of this stuff, you just need to make sure that like what you're doing is matched to your lifestyle. Like all of that stuff. So that's sort of the scope of the book. I mean, one of the things I've really enjoyed ever since I put it out is that sometimes I'll see hits from Reddit on my blog, and then I will go look up like my blog on Reddit, and I'll see people who are saying, wow, I love just sending this to people who seem like they are very, very concerned about, wanting to get started with worship correctly. And I'm like, yes, this is exactly what this book is for. So I really appreciate that.
I think I've read it and I've referenced it and I've linked to it and I've quoted it and all kinds of things. I think one great thing about it is its simplicity, in that it's very accessible. It's not very dense, which I think speaks to your writing anyways, generally. But as you said, you're kind of covering options as you go. And so it makes things seem very easy to do if people are so inclined to, begin a ritual practice or begin studying different things and so on. Which I think stands in stark contrast to a lot of other attempts at kind of beginner pagan or beginner polytheism books, where, I've seen books on beginning heathenry that include a mead recipe, and what that has to do with religious practice is still beyond me. And yet they still keep publishing things like that. So
Yeah, I think speaking to that, like, again, like this is one of the things I was seeing back when I was using social media, is that you'd get people who just looked so lost, and then other people would just be like, you should do this, it's not hard, or they would just give them just this huge list of things that they could do. And I'm like looking at this and I'm like, you're just going to give this person decision paralysis. They are getting nothing out of this interaction, and you have not addressed any of the core reasons of why they're having issues. So I think that like it's really important to just give people a moment where they can take a breath and then just be like, okay, so like let's just get started. Let's build up from just something that is very basic. I really tried, I think to your point, Snow, like I tried to avoid technical vocabulary unless I was able to explain it in a non like specialist context. I'm on the fence about whether I was successful or not, because I think that especially for like this crowd, I know that what you read, because I've seen your blog posts. I know what I read. I know what, so you do get this kind of desensitization to technical vocabulary, like as you progress in a field. I know that coming from library science, like it's this huge issue that we have where like you're supposed to really keep in mind that for new graduate students, some people do not actually realize that interlibrary loan is usually free at institutions because it has like the word loan in it, or there are all of these terms where you think that it's totally obvious what this means, but it's really not obvious for people who are just slightly distant from what it is you're looking at.
I want to pick up on something that you mentioned just now, and I think it's something that probably comes out of the publishing industries that were close to our communities in the 90s and aughts, because so much 101 material is based around esotericism as opposed to religious instruction. I have found that I've had to do a lot of working backwards in order to teach other people, because what I understand is this is hearth cultists. this is how you do that. And, everybody's going right to, well, how do I use magic? How do I cast spells? Like, realizing that, not only does not everybody have the same religious instruction growing up, where this is a matter of course, like how the basics of the religion are practiced or something that you're thinking about. The problem with a lot of the material that's being published right now is it's really heavy on the mysticism and really light on the thinking about the grounding of the practice. At least in my experience, especially with heathen materials right now, there's a reason why I have a limited number of books that I recommend for people who are completely new to heathenry. And I think a lot of the tack that the Longship took, where they don't recommend like the Eddas, for instance, as an introduction material, because I tried doing that, and without the context that you have to do a lot of digging for and have the time to go digging for, it makes it really confusing how to use this as a resource. And it's one of the things that I appreciate about your writings and what's becoming more of a trend in animist and polytheist circles of, when we say basics of practice, we don't mean esotericism. We mean, how do you literally fucking do this?
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think it's also like when I was a kid, I actually didn't really do that much magic. I did not really read those sections of Silver Ravenwolf. I would look at some of these things and I was like, I don't really want any of these things. I'd be looking in the back of the book, or like, I know that if I asked for this thing and I got what I wanted, maybe this wouldn't go well. I mean, like the closest thing I think I did was like when I still have this book just because like, I want to keep this book for the rest of my life, just so that I understand what like a bad decision is. And that's a good precursor to a story. So when I was like, I think 16 or 17, or maybe I was still 15 or so, I had this book called 365 Goddess. So 365 Goddess was this book that was, I think, from the late 90s, early 2000s, where it had a different goddess from around the world every single day. And there was some kind of like very brief kind of like devotional practice. So I decided to, when it was Durga's Day, pray for awakening with a capital A. And the reason I know it was a capital A was because I like found my journal from that period, and then like I like anointed like a yellow candle with dragon's blood, and then I prayed like from this book, and then like the next 6 months of my life were like really terrible. Like not terrible like in a bad way, but in a like, you have learned a lot about life from all of the events that have transpired. And so I have that book on me because I'm just kind of like, what, like, I'm sure that the author had like thought that like the ideal audience for this book was like, let's say like somebody in their like late 20s to like mid 40s who was involved in like, let's say goddess spirituality or something like that. But I was like just like a kid, and my mom took me to like either like Walden Books or like the local pagan store, and I was like, oh, this looks really, really fun because it's got all of these just little fun devotional practices in it. And then I decided to do some of the things in there, and then it just sort of, maybe not the intended audience, but that is a thing that I did.
I'm sorry, that's fucking sending me. That's amazing. And I'm so happy you kept a hold of that book. I have nothing but respect for that. That is freaking amazing. Oh, holy shit. I mean, you did the thing you asked for, and you definitely got it.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and it's just sort of like, yeah, and I mean, like, and I think the gods know that, like, when it like 15, 16, 17-year-old is like asking your first, like, I feel like it could have been a lot worse if I'd been older. But
Yeah. Oh God, I mean, it did have the intended effect. You certainly awakened.
Yeah,
God,
with a capital A, as is documented in my journal from the period.
with Durga though, damn, yeesh.
And you know, because that's one of the things about like that kind of eclectic kind of paganism is like there were a lot of critiques at the time, and this is also one of the things that got me to move towards Reconstructionism of like that whole thing of like, oh, you know, like people inviting like deities into pagan rituals without like having done their homework about the deities' backgrounds or anything like that. Where of course, like, you know, coming from Platonism, I'm like, oh, there is a way to invite two deities with like conflicting like mythos into a ritual at the same time, but you have to be very, very careful to make sure that these sympathetic connections that you're activating are not the ones that are going to, you know, cause that tension, right? And so there's a little bit of nuance to those kinds of online conversations and, you know, conversations and books at the time about those things, but at the same time, it's like, you know, this is why I see Reconstructionism as like a methodology, and I'm including like I think, you know, just like based on some of the stories that I've mentioned, like when I think of Reconstructionism, I think about it just broadly as library research. Like you should be doing research, you know, on some level, and I mean like for deities who are commonly worshipped, that should be pretty easy nowadays with the internet, although AI has made Google search really, really terrible.
Oh
And
my God.
no, like I looked up something about Apollon because I was trying to get to theoa.com to like look up a reference, and it gave me this like summary from the Rick Riordan wiki that was telling me about the time that Apollon like, you know, lost his powers and went to high school, and I was like, this is not this is a fictional like story that came out within the past few decades. This is not, because it's AI, it can't tell the difference. So it's, yeah, yeah.
I get it, because like half the shit I look for, especially if I'm trying to look for Thor, it's somebody summarizing a Marvel wiki or an AI, which is worse.
I mean, if the Marvel films are as bad as I think they are at this point, then they might as well be written by AI. So,
Don't tempt them; they'll do it.
oh, I'm sure they already have. Um, One thing that I'm curious about is how, how a lot of pagans really seem to struggle with a sense of era. And what I mean by that is lots of people, when they get into polytheistic practices and devotional practices, I mean, we keep talking about the kind of cliches and stereotypes around the Reconstructionist movements. A lot of it kind of verges on reenactment and romantic notions of what was and what has been and such. And yet, you seem very comfortable in the present. It doesn't mean necessarily happy with everything that's going on in the world and current affairs, but you're content with the fact that we live in 2025 and you live in the US and so on and so forth, which again seems to contrast greatly with what a lot of other pagans sort of struggle with and try and juggle. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe how you've navigated that and if that has been easy. I know for a while you were kind of writing about how you were deleting social media accounts and reducing your online presence. And you mentioned that earlier, which again, a lot of people seem to struggle with. And there seems to be this big notion in pagandom that if you're not blogging about it, you're not really doing it. And if you're not putting it on Instagram, then you didn't really set up a shrine, did you? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with everything going on in 2025, like I think that we are living in interesting times. So, like, you know, give a nod to what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's just this sort of, you know, and it's not to say that I don't have a sense of nostalgia. It's just that I think that, like, in terms of, you know, like we're never going to build a time machine that's going to take you back. And even if you did, I mean, like, you know, women's rights in antiquity were not that great, you know, and you know, like there are a lot of things like vaccines. I love vaccines, like all of these things that are really, really good. So I do appreciate a lot of the stuff that we have, but it's also like, you know, if you decide that you're going to make these arbitrary cutoffs, then you're cutting off the ways in which like we as like the Anglosphere, like learned about the gods in the first place. So you're cutting off a lot of that, both like beautiful sometimes, but also occasionally problematic, just sort of depending on the time period and what's going on. Just transmission into the English language of information about the gods, which, you're missing out on like Thomas Taylor, who was mostly great except for like that one thing that he wrote about women. I really like Thomas Taylor. Like on my blog yesterday, I shared a hymn that he wrote that I just like really, really, really love. But he was living when he was living. You're missing out on like, again, like in Platonism, there was an entire Platonic, I think they were sort of Christian Platonists, but they were in like Missouri and in the Midwest, and they had this huge thing that was going on in the mid-late 19th century. It ended up petering out because they, I guess, just never really got into Darwinian evolution, which, that was a thing at the time. It was very, that was a very big cultural rift in the United States. So you're missing all of those things. Like in terms of like deities I worship, you'd be missing like Keats and Byron and Shelley and just a lot of these things. And while many of them may not have been like practicing polytheists, they have this sort of like undercurrent like within modern polytheist culture. I think that some of the more fascinating sections of those books about various classical deities that have come out from, I'm forgetting the publisher, but they're the ones that have those sort of like the bold sort of color blocks, and they have like a symbol and a circle in the middle. The Gods and Heroes of the Ancient World, I think that's what they're called. But there's this section in those books where they talk about the cultural transmissions after, after Christianity happened and all of that. And some of the stuff is actually quite cool. And so I think that like in terms of just sort of finding your place in the continuity and just owning that, like I said earlier, that like you can't really like you can't just voyeuristically kind of just like put your hands up against glass and, take the place of, people who, like were, living at the time. I mean, like one of the big culture clashes online was also that, people who are the daughter cultures of ancient cultures have very different relationships with antiquity than we do. And I feel like, especially in the United States, like, I don't know about you, like, Sarah and Emily, but like, when I was taking world history, like my teacher kept getting shipped to Kuwait because he was in the National Guard, and we just had a string of substitute teachers. So I really did not have any world history. And I think that that's true of a lot of people, even though I did try to make it up by taking history college classes. But like, I think that, like the lack of global literacy in America is kind of makes these conversations harder, especially when, a lot of people are arguing and like tensions are really, really running high, and you don't all have like a shared framework that you're working from. Especially nowadays with like, so you said also like the internet just sort of, it just has like a lot of like toxic undercurrents, and especially with the ways the algorithms like reward unpleasant confrontational behavior instead of like actually like figuring things out, or they end up radicalizing people instead of, keeping people on like the videos that were kind of normal that they were looking at on YouTube. So
Yeah, it's one of those things where I feel kind of like stuck between, because so much of my own work is through my blog, but also, I've got a couple of YouTube videos up, and I've got a YouTube series on the basics of heathenry and things like that. But like, if I was to try to do like a YouTube series where I wanted to actually get some traction, that is a career into and of itself at this point because of how much work is involved. Watching the folks at like Crash Course, and Emily turned me onto this, and I appreciate that. The religion Crash Course, realizing how much behind the scenes production they had to do to make it launch, let alone get the viewership they did, was just amazing, especially when you consider like the first YouTube video that was uploaded way back when it first dropped was like a day at the zoo. And the algorithms that they're involved with now are so complicated that even people who do this as a professional living can't really tell you what the secret sauce is because every time they think they got it figured out, it switches. It's very frustrating, and that makes it really hard to recommend, go on the internet. When people say, "Oh, just go Google it," it's like we can't do that anymore. You actually have to spoon feed people links because they're going to find half the time it's AI bullshit. Like when you go on Amazon and you look up pagan, one of the top authors is Mary Silva, and that's an AI. That's an AI author. Like you can't just tell people to Google shit anymore. You actually have to kind of give them links and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the power of libraries because I think that, like as far as like locating any good information is concerns, like, the libraries do have like a catalog and have a ton of ebooks now, like, or at least the libraries that still have funding in the United States have a ton of ebooks right now. And it's possible to raise local taxes to cover the subscription fees if they're meaningful to people in a specific community as well. Just to throw that out there of like some little glimmer of hope. And so, there are those options. And I mean, like, I work in academia, but we have like a ton of electronic resources. And while I would say that like there is an academic bias to like those resources in a way that, like we're all aware of because we've read scholars talking about like, modern paganism, I'm sure, and polytheism, and sometimes they are nice and sometimes they are really not nice. So
I have a bone to pick with a professor from Layne University for his great courses series.
yeah, no, I think my bone to pick is with the woman who wrote like this kind of ethnography of like children of pagan parents, where she basically just used her whole dissertation to talk about inner child theory. And I was like looking at this and I was like, this was Massachusetts, but I'm pretty sure that like it just seemed very weird to me, even though I knew that it was a different region of the country. And, who knows, maybe people were trying to like explore their inner children in the way that she was talking about. But it just seems like um, a weird difference, or yeah, but there are also like there's an awareness within classics now that there's this entire hidden audience that's going to buy books that is like the modern polytheist community, which I think a lot of classicists feel a little bit uncomfortable with, because I'm sure that some of them are pulling all-nighters as they're like trying to finish deadlines, or all of that kind of stuff, where there's a bit of responsibility there, but there's also, I think, a bit of a sense of ownership. But yeah, I think like online information can be really dicey sometimes. I mean, like to your point about like YouTube videos, I was watching this week a video from Jaron Lanier. He probably does not pronounce his surname the French way, but he's a technologist in Silicon Valley who's not on social media. He wrote the book like 10 Reasons to Delete Your Social Media Right Now, or whatever the title was. But he's recently been talking about like AI and a bunch of other issues. And one of the things that he did say is that like with the incentives that you have on like the modern social media platforms, one option could be to start looking at it like, in pods of like communities instead of just as individuals, because people will feel more socially accountable if they feel like they're part of a community that is putting out content together, where it's not like you have one person and then like their staff, but then it's a community responsibility, and where you all just kind of like live or die by like your collective efforts. And so maybe Google is actually moving people in that direction in a certain way, like at least for like those channels where it's there isn't like a sort of like a figurehead with staff. But I think that kind of the model that he had for that did sound kind of exciting.
That's really cool. And I would love to see more communities adopt this kind of more holistic instead of having, just figureheads. I think figureheads can be useful, but yeah, more collective, please. I think that's actually, like you mentioned, the power of libraries. I think that's actually one of the power of libraries, because it's not just a figurehead, a librarian saying this is the only thing that is valid. You're looking to other people, especially when it's not your subject of expertise. You're like, well, this is what the experts say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like in libraries, it's also like, so I work with scientists, and so it's also like sometimes you are working with people who are archivists or in the humanities or other things, like depending on like what people want. I mean, one of the really cool things that's coming out of science right now is that a lot of researchers are very interested in ways to talk to the public about climate change that are not scary. Because one of the huge barriers is that like you have scientists saying, like everything is terrible, and then people are like, oh, this sounds like apocalypticism. Like we were here during like the 19th century with the Great Awakenings. We are not doing that again. But like on the flip side, half of the earth is on fire right now, and the other half
Hmm.
is suffering from floods. And so, like it does take some savviness. And I mean, like I'm actually like, and I think this is also one of the really interesting things about reading in the Platonic tradition. It's like the number of people who were probably behind all of the authors that we're reading who've survived. Like you have because late antiquity was a slave society, so you have like the slaves that were supporting like the household and the philosophical schools. You have the women who were probably also trained in philosophy, because a lot of philosophers children did have skills, and so I'm assuming that a lot of them were acting as secretaries to their husbands if a Platonist was married. That same thing that happened in the early modern period, where you have like a lot of like sisters and wives as co-authors of like Tycho Brahe's sister, Sophia. Like she was actually doing a lot of his astrological charts by the end of his life, for example. And so I don't see why the same thing wouldn't apply back then. But then you have like the students often who are taking the course notes and all of that are sort of feeding back into that loop. And so like you have these people who are like figureheads, but it's like they're not living in a vacuum. Like there are people around them who are making the community possible. I think that really comes out the most in the Phaedrus commentary that we have from Hermias, which is a set of lecture notes from Syrianus, because in that commentary, there are two places where he notes that Proclus has a question for Syrianus. And so like they're literally like you're seeing people like as they're actually learning, and that's just such a I think it's a rare thing. I'm not very familiar with like the broader scope of what we have surviving from the period, but it's a really interesting example of just like the human element.
I think one interesting thing that you've kind of touched on here, both in kind of when you're talking about it in antiquity and talking about it now, is essentially the weird views and attitudes people have towards academia and academics. Um, I know in my experience, there seems to be something of a kind of paradoxical tension where lots of pagans and polytheists are seeking to reference academics and seeking to cite academics and almost seeking academic approval, but at the same time are very, very quick to dismiss anyone vaguely related to education or academia as being part of the problem in their ivory towers and inherently elitist and all the rest of it. I don't know if um, I don't know if your experiences align with that or maybe greatly differ with that.
Yeah, so I have a lot of feelings about this that are really complicated. So um, when I was, I think, 16 or 17, because I brought up that like the same time we were going to pagan circles and stuff, and involved in like paganism, we were still going to the Unitarian Society. And because of like where we were located, it was next to a university. Like the person who was in charge of like the teenager religious education was often a student at like that local university. And so one time we got somebody who was actually a philosophy student. So my senior year of high school was like when I actually found out that there were people who were talking about interesting things in general, because she was just like, I'm just going to show these kids like some philosophy things. And then I think I even like wrote one of my college admission essays about how amazing like that experience was. But I never took a philosophy course when I was at undergrad because I was like, oh, like I'm, like pagan, and, like I know that this is probably not going to be accepted here. Like I, deliberately like chose the career path that I chose because like I knew that like if I wanted to do any kind of pagan or polytheistic theology as kind of like a career path, I wouldn't be allowed to be open, and I just basically have to like have this kind of hidden double life. Um, in a way that I didn't really want to, because then it's sort of like it's not like the same as like, when you're at a normal workplace where you're not putting like your religion in the face of everybody around you, but if they ask about what you're doing for the holidays, you could tell them, oh yeah, my family doesn't celebrate Christmas, my mom's going to come up and we're going to do like a little solstice thing, like, so can you say that if you're in that kind of that difference, in that different environment. And so I see why there's a little bit of resentment there towards scholars, just because again, like it's a very different scenario in a certain sense than what you see in, and I'm going to make the analogy to Buddhism again, like there are so many scholar practitioners, or in like Christianity, there are so many scholar practitioners. And so that kind of difference is, I think, meaningful and also very horrible. And the scholars who have been out like haven't been treated very well by members of the scholarly community. But at the same time, I think that it's especially like with the language barriers that exist, because most people, at least in like the United States, do not take Greek or Latin. Like I never had those when I was younger. I mean, I've been meaning to take an ancient Greek class or learn it, but then again, like I have that same issue where like the adult learning courses that exist are pretty much all about biblical Greek, because they assume that you're Christian and you want to learn it for those reasons. But yeah, I think there are just a lot of messy, I think, feelings with this. And I think that it's just part of that whole legacy of Christianization, then, like the marginalization of certain types of religiosity.
And I think it probably doesn't help that, nowadays we have people in positions of influence saying that the world is tired of experts, and everyone seeking to get into paganism is scared of doing it wrong from the off. And so I think there's something to that as well. Is kind of this idea that the academics and the people with degrees or who work in these fields are maybe the ones who feel they're in the position to say whether something is right or not, and people are kind of scared of being wrong, I suppose.
But then it's also that there are actually like a fair number, I think, of scholars, like especially in Platonism and late antiquity, who are actually secretly like pagans. It's just like, how do you figure out who those people are? Like sometimes it's like sort of obvious because you just sort of trace who they know. And but there are all of these like open secrets or closed secrets that are not really secret, because if you can trace people back that easily, like is it a secret, like all of these things, but it's just not talked about.
And we have the burgeoning cliche now of the academic become YouTuber, and sort of a lot of cynicism around that from people.
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen that as much, and probably because I'm off of social media.
That's fair. I mean, it's one thing that I have seen increasingly. Um, like one of the lecture series that I have been watching has been the Gresham College series, especially the ones with Ronald Hutton, but they have a ton of lectures online. Um, and I think that it's another resource, but it's not in that mode of, well, I'm striking out on my own and I'm striking back against the ivory tower kind of YouTube professors that I've seen before as well. And I think that there's so many moving parts right now as far as like ways that we can look at why people are striking out on their own. But I think one of the big problems is, and this has been like a couple of folks that I follow, has been not only can I not research in the ways that I want to, it's becoming increasingly irrelevant to my students to even present the material as I'm understanding it or as I've been taught. Because some of these guys are so checked out, or on the other hand, they're so stressed that just the facts is like what I can get done. I think that it's kind of a two or three multi-pronged problem, right? Where the attention economy is so rough that learning is in a lot of ways harder. I came out of the old library card system where you had to learn how to research on a baseline of how to use the category systems. So you got taught a baseline of what library science looked like at a very young age. You've got kids who've taken library science for well, not library science, but like media literacy for literally years, and they can't walk around a library and find anything on their own. Which, everybody has their own learning curves, their own learning issues, and all that. So I'm not shaming these kids, just to be perfectly clear about it, or adults for that matter. But I think that we're at the crossroads of a lot of issues that are coming to a head all at once. And I think that I'm still undecided about whether or not YouTube professors are a help or a hindrance in this. And I think, honestly, it comes down to the individual professor. And sometimes whether or not they have institutional support. Because like Gresham College puts Hutton stuff online, no problem. But then you've got folks who strike out on their own, and they've either got completely off the wall, bonker ass theories, or they're like getting nothing but adjunct professor jobs and they can't keep a livelihood without doing YouTube and TikTok on the side. And so, like, that's an institutional problem. That's a systems problem. So, and that's not even getting into, hey, is this, are the theories that this particular professor who is using their credentialing, are they expounding on crackpot theories that have been disproven, or are these fresh new crackpot theories that have to be debunked? Like, not even getting that deep in the weeds on it, it suddenly becomes really like it becomes a research project into itself really quickly. And I think dialogues like these are really important to that, because we can say, hey, look, Rutledge has this, like you mentioned, like Rutledge has the series of books, and those will be going in our show notes. So, like, even at a baseline, having conversations like these are really important, because we can go, like, these are the resources I use. I like them for this purpose. And you can cut through a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and polemic bullshit just by making recommendations that people can follow up on. I think dialogue is the thing that's going to save us.
Yeah, and I think like with the people in academia. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, you haven't spoken at all. You should speak.
I'm sorry. I was just going to add that I think there's also the aspect of defensiveness when it comes down to people's personal religions. And if you are recon and scholars come forward with new research or new information that changes how people view things, is that going to change how you practice your personal religion? Or is that going to change your beliefs? And even if you're not recon, if you're like influenced by the past at all and new research comes out, I think people tend to be on the defensive when it comes to religion, because it is so personal, and how to integrate, if they choose to integrate that new information into their practice or into their belief system or into their worldview, I think can be very, very touchy, especially if a lot of pagans are ex-Christians, and some are anti what they see as like big organizations because of that. And so I think they have that fear that these scholars are trying to tell us what we have to do. On the same end, because a lot of pagans are ex-Christians, they're also used to having everything established already. And so when it's not established, but things are changing, like on the daily or on the weekly or on the yearly, it is just a new way that they have to learn to interact with their religion and their beliefs.
I think that's the value of just like starting with like hearth cultists is like the core thing, because like that's not really, I mean, like your hearth cultist is like, you give your daily hearth prayers, and then everything else kind of builds on top of that. I mean, if somebody like is digging a new well in Egypt, for example, and hit something, and then they find like a new trove of like texts from late antiquity, or something like that, then that is beautiful. I mean, like you know, I'm sure that there would be new things in that. I mean, the Herculaneum scrolls, they're currently in the process of that like AI imaging, and that's going to be really, really, really fun when they come out with it. And so I think that there's like a difference in like, what threat means, like depending on like how people are even like approaching establishing like religiosity. And I'm also like aware as you're speaking that like I think in the northern traditions, because there are fewer textual resources, maybe you're sort of like loosely kind of alluding to stuff in that area, more than slightly farther south. But yeah, I think a lot of the same principles hold. Like if you have like a basic, practice, I mean, that also I think goes to the institutional thing. Like in the Souls and Her Statues, I'm like, have a good hearth practice, because that way, like if something happens to your group, you're only going to be gutted about the group. You're not going to be gutted about your religiosity, because there are so many examples in like the broader culture of people who are joining groups and the group becomes everything to them. And I mean, like at the end of the day, like you don't need to like, you don't need to replace your identity with this group identity. Like you should come to the group as an individual with stuff to contribute to it. You know, Dealing with people is hard sometimes, but like, it's like that. But I do want to say, like coming from academia, academics have like a lot of incentives, especially people who are on the promotion tenure timeline. And then on the flip side, people who have finished the promotion tenure timeline who finally get to do what they want. And so like a lot of the contents, like I'm thinking about Michael Griffin, who has like olympiadores.net, but I think he also has a YouTube channel where he is writing some stuff. I know that Danielle Layne, at Gonzaga, is doing this AI philosophy project with this. And when I say AI philosophy, I know that everybody's thinking ChatGPT, but it's actually this sort of like semantic knowledge graph on the back end that's designed to try to help people learn better by sort of broadening their perspectives, or at least that's how I've seen it explained. But like, Danielle Layne has a YouTube channel for Palinode Productions, with a bunch of other people working on the project as well. Like, yeah, there are a lot of people who are doing just like really cool work. But then like the people who go alt-ac, and then decide to become influencers or YouTube personalities, I think that's sort of a different boat. I mean, like we live in a system where everybody has to make a living. And so I think like the good thing there is just to not take anything they do personally, because I mean, if something were like a colloquium on a campus, like I have been to geosciences colloquiums where like I'm pretty sure that an outside observer would be like, these people do not agree on anything. But like literally it will be somebody in the second row who is really angry at the speaker because they did not use this small calculation from a paper that the person wrote 4 years ago about the wind currents coming off of like South America that could completely like disrupt whatever it is with like the climate model projection that they're doing. And so it's actually just sort of like, for people in the discipline, like they have these norms that are very different from outsiders. And I think that that's one of the issues as well when you're talking to academics, is that because academics think and talk to one another very differently from the general public.
Speaking of
people being difficult and people thinking differently and individuals being complicated. Earlier, you mentioned Shelley, Byron, and Keats. And I know on your website and in your writing, you've addressed the notions of quote unquote immoral elements in myths or problematic quote unquote things in myths and how people are understanding these things. How I was wondering if you could basically speak about sort of how you are honoring sort of Shelley, Byron, and Keats, who are these very complicated figures who are sort of controversial in their day, viewed different ways now, and then sort of how you do sort of navigate these ideas that people have about gods because of different myths and things, because those feel like connected points to me.
Yeah, I think that one of the really valuable things about like the Platonic tradition is that there is like this really heavy, like allegorical kind of kind of tradition with it. I mean, like the one of the reasons that I really got into it was because like I was in the middle of reading Platonic dialogues, and then um, I learned that there was this citation about something that I was really interested in that was in the Phaedrus commentary that Hermias had written down and that is based on Syrianus lectures. It was that little bit about Helen of Troy and like the alternative myth. Because one of the hills that I will die on is that I really think that people need to like actually make a movie out of the version where it's actually Helen of Troy's like a robot body double that is in there and she's in Egypt the whole time, like because there are multiple myth versions. But what I was really struck by on like first read, like within the commentary tradition, was just how like richly like lit crit it was. So like I took a lit crit class at a college when I was still in high school, and I loved lit crit. It was amazing, just like how you could just like pick apart just like lines of things and then just sort of like pull out like these meanings using like this framework. And I really loved it. And I loved that I was seeing that. And so I think that I think that there are other philosophical traditions that do things that are similar, like in their commentary traditions as well. And of course, like, especially when looking at a lot of interconnected philosophical traditions, like there's a lot of overlap with, like what people will do. But I think that when it comes to like to myths where like things like that happen, like I think that it's really important to do that for one. But I also think it's really important, like Proclus says this someplace in his corpus, where it's like you can tell the type of society that people are in by the way that they write their myths and the myths that they're inspired to write. And so I think that, in modern terms, like people say this all the time, like, the types of stories that people tell, like reflect like where they are. And like, you're never going to have like a set of myths that's completely disconnected from, what is going on in the environment that people are in. Like, because, in order for them to be like helpful to people, they have to have those sympathies. Like there's somebody who online a few years ago was doing an exegesis of some kind of the Homeric hymn to Demeter with all of the things about like arranged marriages and everything like that was in like the broader society. And that creates like this enormous amount of depth for understanding like why that is so moving of a myth, and why it sort of, it sparks the mysteries as well.
So I suppose a lot of this really kind of circles back to people being able to access these things and be able to access these texts and be able to grapple with these ideas and sort of sit down with them and be able to find the resources to do so.
Yeah, and I also think that like again, like people really can't do that on their own. I do think that it is important to read things in a group. Like, people should be gathering together and just like reading the myths round robin and just pausing every now and then to just talk through them and what they think like the myths mean, because everybody has a different backgrounds. Like people will all bring different things to the table, and then you can get a richer experience out of that.
I think too the excuse me. I appreciate how you say, approach things as an individual and then as a community. And especially because, you're talking about building things from the ground up, and not leaving chunks of yourself behind if a group decides, well, this is enough. Um, I also think that the ultra individualist response of, well, no communities are okay, and I've got to have this ideal community before I get started. Kind of a community delayed is a dream deferred kind of a deal, right? Because if we're waiting for the perfect community to show up, that's never going to happen. But if we show up for community, we can make things happen because we're the ones that show up, and we get to navigate this particular ship. Um, and I appreciate that you're consistently coming back, especially because we talked about the age of social media being so rough on this particular issue, where you're consistently coming back to, like, yes, community, yes, your own individual practice. It's like, yeah, we can hold two things at the same time. We have hands for that. Um, it doesn't have to be a zero sum game. We can indeed hold individual practice and communal practice in balance with one another. And I really appreciate you continuously hitting on that point and like giving us really clear eyed examples of how we can do that. That is so important. And I appreciate you continuously doing that, not only here in this dialogue, but also on your blog.
Yeah, and I think it's also just sort of like, I know that like especially like in the Platonic tradition, there's just such an emphasis, I think, online of like the Platinian, like alone to the alone kind of thing, where it's like there are a lot of practices that you do have to do alone. But you should not, like, I think, be alone. Like, because like again, like that's where it can lead to, like somebody just sort of like really just sort of like going too far into something that's more of their own inner world than, like necessarily something that is, I guess, like rigorous. I don't think that that's the right word to choose there, but I hope that that what I mean is intelligible. Um, but yeah, and I mean, like to the point about social media, I mean, the algorithms are just really not built for bringing people together. And I mean, like the more I think about it, the more I'm like, well, the only places where I am are places where, like they're not algorithm driven. Like you're still able to read everything that people are saying. It's much more conversational. I really do prefer talking to people over Zoom to that sort of thing. I think also like I mean, I'm in my late 30s. I'm gonna need reading glasses in a few years. And like I don't know about you, but like my stamina for just like being on a device as I've gotten older has just consistently kind of gone down. Because it's just not ergonomic. And it's also just like you get fatigued on some level, but it's yeah, I think that like the best way to fight back against like that algorithmic, decline, again, like that, like the 10 reasons why you should delete your social media right now talks about he calls them like bummer technologies. It's an acronym that stands for a few things, but he talks about like the ways in which they just really kind of like turn everybody into an asshole, and like, and then he's like, oh, not you though, but like they do turn everybody into a bit of a jerk. And so and it's just not really like, if you want to have like a positive community, like I don't really see how you can really do that in those spaces. I mean, it's fine if like you are trying to meet people there. I mean, like I do think that I have gotten a lot out of some types of algorithmic driven communication. So like if I'm feeling sad and I want cat videos, I know where to go. And I know that it will keep feeding me cuter and cuter cat videos. Like, like those kinds of things. Or like if you've got like a medical diagnosis that you're navigating and you really just sort of want to see what people are saying about it, or if you want tips and advice, like there are a lot of great communities that have come around social media related to various types of diagnoses. Like I had to have surgery in the fall, and so I was on a Reddit community, like not me personally posting, but just like reading about people who had had a very large like it was it was like a uterine fibroid, and it was like the size of a 5-month pregnancy, and so they had to take it out laparoscopically, and I needed information on recovery and all of that stuff. And then I got like I'm neurodivergent, and I didn't know for most of my life, and now I like just like will look things up by typing in the problem that I have, and then like an additional word, and then I'm like, okay, now I'm seeing stuff that I can actually use. So there are some positives, but I think that there are other ways to get the positive things that don't necessarily rely on the things that are actually making everything really, really toxic.
100%. 100%. Um, I had a thought and I've lost it. Speaking of neurodivergence, damn, I'll have to come back to it. Somebody else jump.
So one thing I'm curious about is what keeps you writing the blog? What keeps you writing Callisti? What are you reading these days? Are you researching these days?
Oh, those are some really, really big questions. I mean, like I sometimes just like feel like an all-consuming need to share
Mhm.
stuff. I think that like I blog a little bit less now just because a lot of what I've had to say is in the Souls and Her statues. And then I mean, like work has been in a weird place. And then like when you're navigating the American healthcare system, you only have so much energy for like other things at the same time. But I think it's, like the stuff that I'm reading right now. So I'm currently in like a liminal space. So I've been just going over a lot of the notes that I've had on things. I've been rereading some bits and pieces of Damascus' Life of Isidore, which is basically the set of fragments from his Life of Isidore that is talking about the Platonic communities in Athens and Alexandria. And it's fascinating, like just sort of people watching. And so that's really, really good. For Thargelia, I'm going to reread some hymns to Artemis and to Apollon. I think I'm going to reread the Prolegomena to Platonic philosophy, which is anonymously written, and I think it's distributed by the Prometheus Trust, which has like the U.S. distributor is like Kindred Star Books. And just as full disclosure, I know who the person who owns Kindred Star Books. So like, you know, like it, yeah. But anyway, so I think that that's sort of where I'm headed these days with some reading. Recently, I've been reading Proclus writings on Providence with a group of people. Um, yeah. So I think it's sort of again like I think you reach a point where you've hit on a lot of like the main text that you want to read, where you just get to choose your own adventure with a little bit less of like the hectic feeling and the more of like the so what do I want to do feeling. Um, yeah.
So is it just kind of the excitement around what you're reading and choosing to do, and this ability, this sort of trait you mentioned of wanting to share stuff that just kind of keeps Callisti going then?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, like I do also write fiction, and so a lot of my thoughts as of late have been around just sort of different things that I'm working on, like my writing. So, like one of the writing projects that I have right now is kind of low key a tribute to this book that I read by a somebody who studies late antiquity, where I was because I'm really just fascinated by the Damascus like Life of Isidore and all of these sort of like the human elements. I read The Final Pagan Generation. I think maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago at this point, but like I have this sort of story that I'm working on that's set in the world building project that I do, where it's about two like new adults who've joined a philosophical school and are trying to figure out a lot of things about, you know, being new adults at the same time that they're solving like a ghost mystery and then trying to figure out like what their study path is going to be. So it's so that's sort of fun, and I'm currently blocking that out in my head. I also have some other projects that I'm thinking about, like specifically with like Apollon, and thinking about just a lot of the stuff that I've read in the Platonic tradition and trying to find ways of talking about like the gods in a new way. I think that, you know, with thinking about like theology, which is one of the things that I really, really, really love, a lot of the world building that I do involves like deities and like theology and just sort of like these heroic stories and things. And like my hope is like, even though it's a fictional context, that there's always like some kind of element of, you know, like real theology in them in a certain sense, even if a lot of it is, you know, it's as fantastical as, you know, a lot of stories in those genres are, but like, you know, it's sort of, yeah. So I'm doing a lot of different things.
That's really cool to hear. If no one else has any other questions or pointers, this may be a good time to come towards a concluding section. We've been going for almost 2 hours.
Yeah, I want to really express my appreciation for you coming on here and exploring. And it feels like a lot of these conversations, you know, we get 2 hours into it, and it feels like sometimes we've only scratched the surface on any given topic. If folks want to find more resources from you, where can they look?
Okay, so they can go to several places. So I have a blog, Callisti.blog. Do you want me to paste that into the chat, or you know where it is? So
I got you.
yeah, I think that that's like the best place to probably go for anybody, because I've tried to make things very accessible. So like the Souls and Her statues, you just click a link in the sidebar of that, and then you were there. You can, you know, click on some other stuff as well. I do have a Substack, because I've tried to like separate out my fiction writing, and it is, sorry, I'm trying to like actually paste this into the chat. Okay, there we go. It is pangrammaticae.substack.com. And so it's very different. And so there I talk about a lot of world building. Sometimes I talk about conlangs. You know, it's very story driven, but there's a little bit of feedback between that and Callisti anyway. I think that those are the two main places where people can find my stuff. I mean, I also have like a website, but pretty much it'll all funnel back into the same places. Like the Soul Center Statues is free. The Acts of Speech poetry book I wrote a few years ago is available wherever you read, probably. And the fiction novellas are also probably available wherever you read. So
Wonderful. To stall and cover for Sarenth typing stuff for the show notes, Emily, if people want to find you, where can they find you?
Right now they can find me at streakingfate.wordpress.com. How about you, Snow?
You can find me at snowthegoth.com, and everything links from there. And you will find me regularly having referenced the Souls in Her statues. What about you, Sarenth?
Oh, you can find me a lot of places. Most places, social media wise, I'm Sarenth or Sarenth Odinson. You can find me on my blog, which is sarenth.wordpress.com. You can find me at patreon.com/Sarenth Odinson, where you can hire me to write on a topic or a prayer for you for one of your gods, ancestors, or Vater. You can also find me, like I said, on all pretty much all social media. Where I'm at is like Sarth on Blue Sky. I do have a Substack, and it's it's my username here. It's really hard to find. Um, so yeah, you can find me there. And you can also find this show at aroundgrandfatherfire.com. You can also find us if you want to support us at patreon.com/aroundgrandfatherfire. And you can find us on agfpodcast.bskysocial and Instagram agf.podcast. You can also find us on Threads. So I really appreciate, again, Kaye, thank you so much for coming on this show and for sharing so much time with us. This has
Yeah,
been a real,
thanks.
oh, absolutely. This has been a blast. I really appreciate it. So, is there anything else that people want to cover? I think that I didn't miss anything this time.
If you did, it will be in the show notes, or you can find it from aroundgrandfatherfire.com.
All right. Well, since that is everything, I want to thank all of our listeners, our Patreon supporters, and folks who are joining us for the first time, folks who have been with us for a while. And I want to thank Kaye, and I want to thank my co-hosts, and we will see you all next time around the fire.